if they have just a couple consonants and a couple vowels, they can start to sound those words out. And once they start to have a purpose, there's reasons that they want to do it.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Alexa, and welcome to the Educating the Whole Child series. Today, we are with a very special guest, my friend Laura from Little Stories That Stick. Hi, Laura.
Hello, good morning.
Well, welcome. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation. I have so many notes, so many questions for you to learning about literacy. So before we even get started, tell me, who are you? Well, tell them, because I already know who you are. And what got you into literacy and storytelling to begin with?
Yeah, so my name is Laura, and I'm a former public school teacher. I taught pre-K and kindergarten for 17 years. And over the last 10 years, I really dove into exploring how to use oral storytelling with children and myself telling stories, as well as them telling stories and acting them out, as I learned from Vivian Paley. And then I'd say over the last 6 years, when I was in kindergarten, I really started to learn more about the current body of research on the science of reading, and learned that I was teaching children how to read the wrong way. So I started to really re-educate myself and think differently about early literacy. And through that, and then having my own 2 children, I just began to take all my content knowledge and the skills that I learned in my classroom and what started to unfold with my children as I told them stories or provided them with early literacy experiences. And that brought me to creating Little Stories That Stick, that I've been running on Instagram for the last 2 years. And I just launched a podcast to start sharing some of my stories in a different format. And that's what's brought me here.
Awesome. You said that you were teaching literacy the wrong way.
Yeah.
What does that mean? What's the wrong way?
Well, in a nutshell, what it meant was I was teaching kindergartners to guess what the words were on the page. So basically, there's this strategy that a lot of teachers were taught in their preparatory programs or through curricula that was shared out with us. And we used this thing called the 3 cueing strategy. And so the questions you would repetitively ask children was, does it look right? Does it make sense? Does it sound right? And when we were using some of those leveled texts with young children, particularly this was in kindergarten, where it might say, I see the ball, I see the alligator, I see the giraffe, whatever it was, right? It was this predictable pattern. So we were basically teaching them to memorize the sentence, I see the, and maybe they were not actually understanding anything of the words they were reading. They just had it memorized. And then when they got to that word, giraffe, alligator, cat, ball, instead of it being a word that they could actually sound out, we would say, what do you think it is? Or look at the picture, because the picture would have an alligator or a giraffe. And this is how teachers all around the country have been teaching reading. And it was like one of those moments where my mentor, when she pulled the wool out of my eyes, and I was like, oh my gosh, I am teaching children to guess. This was the tool we were using. And then it becomes really hard to unlearn, right? So as they start to learn phonics skills and know that they can sound out a word, they're not going to, because one of the first strategies they were taught was look at the picture. What would make sense? What could this word be? Instead of what is this word?
Mm-hmm. So is this the same technique that I've seen? I remember because when I used to volunteer in my older schools, public school, and I would go to the preschool class, she would have this bracelets with the sight words. And it was the sight word of the day. Is that the same memorization by seeing? I think there was in the old days, there was a program with pictures of words, and like they had it to, like, they would show it to babies, and they would, like, recognize it from the word, and they were reading, but they were actually just memorizing how it looked. So that's kind of the same concept, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, there's, a whole ton of stuff to nerd out on in this science of reading, and especially around like what is the actual way that a young child's brain processes information. And we know children can memorize things, right? We know that they memorize songs, they memorize poems, they learn the word triangle, or they know that a sheep says ba, right? They learn these things because of rote memorization, a lot of it, right? That's how we expose our children to things. And so although a 5-year-old or a 4-year-old may see the word THE and know that's the, because this is what they've learned, it's not actually sticking, right? It's not ingrained in them, and it's not being, there's ways now to teach a lot of those high frequency words. Many of them are in fact decodable. So they're actually words that children could sound out and use the skills that they need to continue to be successful readers.
Okay. So you say a lot about sounding. So that would mean the foundation to reading would be sounds.
Yeah, absolutely. So the biggest thing that in preschool or kindergarten, or with children from 3 to 5, that we can do is play with words, play with sounds. And this falls under this big umbrella of phonological awareness. So phonological awareness is hearing sounds in words. And it can be broken down into these 2 other categories, which is phonological sensitivity, and that's hearing larger parts of words. So knowing when I say the cat is fat, knowing that that's different words, right? Knowing that there's the cat is fat. That's 4 words, right? And then there's phonemic awareness, which is a more specialized skill where children are having to start to notice individual sounds. So the phonemes. So knowing that cat starts with the sound k, or that cat has 3 sounds, cat. So there are these 2 little parts that fall under this bigger part, right? And so the biggest thing that we can do for children is expose them to oral language. And you're not going to be surprised to hear me say one of the best ways we can do this that's in a playful and fun way is by telling stories, right? And whether that just be a story of your day, a story of, the 3 little pigs, or a story that you've made up, what you're doing there is just modeling what words can sound like, right? And your emphasis, and when you're storytelling, when you're telling stories naturally, we humans are storytellers. So your voice is inflecting, you're using facial expressions, just like when you're reading a book. Very few, people that are interacting with young children read a book in a monotone way, right? To change your voice or add excitement, or you read it in different ways or different tones of voice for different characters, because that's what engages children. And so you're naturally going to start doing the same thing when you're telling a story. And that's what's, pulling the children in even more.
Yeah. One of the things that I've learned recently, just following you and your content, is when I think about storytelling, I think about coming up with my own stories. And I think there was a video, and you were telling, it was like a bedtime story, and you were telling your daughter or your son something that when they were little, when they were born, the story of the day. And then that made me realize, it's like, oh, not every story needs to be the bear in the jungle and the bee that speaks. It could just be what they did that day. And actually yesterday I was like, I want to do a storytelling. I know I'm not good at coming up with this, like the bear and the jungle type of stories, but I can tell them exactly what we did yesterday. And as we were brushing his teeth, I was kind of telling him this story of the sequence of our day, which in a way I'm like, well, a book kind of has sequence of events. So I'm just going to go through it. We went to a fishing event. It was a family event. So I was kind of going through the sequences. We didn't catch anything, but we found a turtle, and then
Yeah, I was gonna say you found a turtle.
well, we didn't. Somebody else did, and I just took a picture of it. But it was like everything that we did, and we learned how to make the knots. And we lost my very first knot that we did. He threw it just to cast it, and it was just went. I didn't do a good knot, so it was part of the story. And I noticed it was like a different interaction of when we sit in bed, because we read every night, and we read stories. Like, it was something sparkled in him that it was so different. And I was like, wow. And storytelling has been, like you said, has been here for ages. Before there was the written word, I think the way they would pass the information, the way they would pass traditions, it was through storytelling. Like, that's how, from generations, they came along, and they kind of, so it's like you said, it's kind of in us already to tell stories. We just have to bring them to light. We've just been so used to, when we think about teaching literacy means letters. Letters means let's pick one letter and let's go with it. You have A, B, C, D, 26, that's 26 weeks. There you go. You have your school year, and they learn the letters. But I realized that not every kid is interested in the letter A in September because it's apple season. I live in Florida. There's no apple seasons. I have to use alligators at some point. So for me, it was very interesting to kind of make the connection that literacy was beyond recognizing the letter and beyond understanding the sound that the letter made, right? So we say the letters because we want to identify the letter, because then we can put it on sticky notes, and we can be like, this is a story, and I can tell my own stories, and I can write my own stories. So when you did an interview and you kind of talked about that, immediately what I went to do, because I like to do things through play, was I gave him a bunch of papers, a stapler. I was so afraid of the stapler, but he knew how to use, like, yeah. I think sometimes we put risk, like anxiety takes over, that I was like, I can't give him a hole puncher. He's going to punch his finger. I can't give him a stapler. And I was like, well, I'm here. We can do this. And he made books. And we made a book, and I told him, what do you want to make a book about? And he did a story about how he went fishing with that. Fishing, it's all his brain, really cares about. And of course, I was not even in the boat picture, even though I always go. But he did it, and I would write the letters, like, the sentences, and then he had his own book. So even sometimes when we pick the books at night, he picks his own book to read. It's a 4-page book. And I kind of like, finally things make sense. Oh, okay, we want to teach them letters so that they can read the words, so that they can read other people's stories, so that they can make up their own stories. And it kind of makes sense. So it brings back to me, it's like, how young, like, what's the right age where we should be doing this type of activities, from, reading to showing them the words, to, drilling them about recognizing the letters, to teaching them the sounds. Like, what's your research and your opinion, because you've been in the classroom and you do it at home, like, what's the right age?
Yeah, so there's so much that you just shared about that I want to comment on. First, I want to highlight how you said that, you said a couple times, I know I'm not good at telling stories, but I think it's really important for us as adults to let that go, right? Because if Manu came to you and said, I'm not good at telling stories, would you let that fly, right? Would you want that to be his inner, thoughts of himself as a storyteller? No, right? So we need to, say that we are good storytellers, and telling a story about, what you did yesterday when you went on the fishing adventure is a story. I mean, according to the Common Core, when they're in kindergarten and first grade, children need to be able to write a personal recount, which is narrating an event that happened to them. And that includes a beginning, middle, and end, and it's in sequence. So that's something that's expected of them as time goes on, to be able to tell about something that they've experienced in their lives and put it in order and include some details and emotion or how they felt about it. So telling stories to our children about, I tell my children all the time about the day they were born, or the day we adopted our puppy, or the day their dad and I got married, big significant events in our lives, but also, oh, do you remember the time we went and just something random that we did? Those are just as valuable and important and are bonding moments for us with our children in the same way that making up a story about a bear in the jungle is, right? There's different elements to it, but at the heart of storytelling is a bonding and connection with the child where we're also modeling how stories can sound. And so I think it's really important to kind of shift that mindset that stories can be anything, even retelling of books we've read. That's what stories are, right? How many versions of The Little Red Hen are there? We would never discredit the author that wrote one of the ones that I love. It's called The Little Red Fort, and it's about a girl who wants to build a fort and her brothers say she can't build and whatever. I would never discredit that author and be like, you didn't write that book, you didn't make that up because it originated from the tale of the Little Red Hen, right? We would never discredit that. So retelling a story like that we've heard is the same as making up our own story. So I think that's really important. And then also holding on to this overarching idea of early literacy is so much more than just letters and letter sounds. That is a significant part. And it is very important. And it gives our children the key to unlocking the written print. But there's so much more to early literacy. There's vocabulary development. There's listening comprehension, being able to auditorily listen to something and comprehend what's being said. There's sequencing. There's oral language development. And then there's all this phonological awareness, like I was talking about, right? So knowing that the word mouse is different than the word house, but that they rhyme and sound similar, right? Because later on, that's going to help them know, oh, if I can read mouse, then the first letters just changed here. I can read house, right? And so thinking about
I never knew, wait, there was so much focus on the rhyming. I'm like, I don't get it. Like, I get it. The cool books have rhymes in it, but I didn't get it. It was literally because they can later on, they can make the connection that they're so similar. And I've been seeing it with my son. I guess they've been talking about rhyming, and he comes up with words, and when we are out and we read a sign or something, and he said, oh, that rhymes with this, and I'm like, oh wow, like I get the listening part of it, but now I can really connect it to reading. It makes total sense.
Exactly. And that's one of my favorite times, when it starts to click with the child, that not only that print is everywhere, right? Like, oh, what does this say? What does that say? What does this say? There's words on this box. There's words on this, cereal box. There's words on that street sign. When they start seeing words and asking what it is, but also when they start really tuning in. And, that does take explicit conversations. That's not something that's organically going to happen through play, that they're going to notice these words sound the same. You have to name it and you have to point it out. But then they do start playing around with it, right? Like my son loves to make up words that rhyme, and he constantly comments and notices on it. And one of the reasons that's really important is because if children aren't able to start hearing those differences, that can be a sign to us as parents or caregivers or educators that we might need to dig a little bit deeper and see what is happening if they're not able to hear rhyming sounds, or they're not able to hear that words are separate sounds, right? All of these foundational skills in hearing sounds and words, or hearing how words are similar and different, are really important, because they can be little indicators to us that there might be something else there that we need to dig into to better understand. And so I think what you had said earlier, or what you had kind of asked, is like, what is the be all end all, right? Like, how many letters should you be teaching, or what letters, or when, or, do you do letter of the week? And I think there's a ton of research out there, and it's hard. I'm not, gonna say one way or the other. What I will say is that just like we teach children, this is a cow and a cow says moo, right? We teach them that. They don't know it. Many children don't see a cow ever in their life, at least in their early years, to know and hear and be like, oh, what's that? Oh, that's a cow. And it can make the sound. Listen, oh, you heard it, right? We're in fact feeding them that language, whether it's through singing Old MacDonald or a puzzle or a game that we're playing, we're teaching them that. The same way that we do that, we can do that with letters and sounds. And it just doesn't have to be this long drawn out thing. It can be rapid fire. It can be super quick. It can be, they see a letter and you're like, oh, that's the letter M. Can you do that? Like, do you feel that? I feel it right there. And move on. And maybe you bring it up again the next day, or that day, every time you see the letter M, you point it out to them, right? So there are some letters that lend themselves to sounds that are easier to say, right? Like M ends in the sound right? It's easier to get that than it is to say, the letter T, you make that sound at the start, right? So there's definitely research and science to the letters that you should introduce first. There's also certain letters that we're exposed to a lot. And if you teach them and they know 6 or 7 letters like M, B, T, A, and U, now they can make words. They can make mat. They can make cut. They can make but. On a note, I'm going to forget, right? You're giving them a reason. So we need to be holding on to that, in that we're not just teaching them a letter abstractly for no reason. We're helping them also make that connection really quickly to, oh, the reason you're learning this sound or this letter is because these words are made up of it. And oh, you want to be able to find your favorite book at the library, you need to be able to read the words and find the letters or whatever it might be. And this bigger idea of doing letter of the week, where you kind of said, okay, there's 26 letters, that's 26 weeks. If you think about it, that's not fast enough for a lot of children, right? That's over 26 weeks. Then they're going to get to the last letter in, like you said, in alphabetical order. Whereas if you're doing 1 or 2 a day, if you're just noticing letters every day, all the time, and pointing them out and making it meaningful for them, that's going to be more beneficial, right? Than this abstract idea of, I'm introducing this letter this week where, it's the letter B and we're going to glue beans along the B because it's a B. And then, we're going to, bounce balls, like all those things you can do. But if you're stretching it out over a week and there's no meaning or purpose to it, and you're just doing it because, it's what's been done or it's easy, you're missing out on what can be really authentic opportunities for children to learn letters in a really meaningful way.
I think you point out like something so interesting. It's the meaning behind it, right? When there is meaning, they're going to grasp the idea a lot easier. I remember when I was first starting to research about this, they told me, well, you need to start with the letters of his name because that is what is more meaningful to him. Mm-hmm. And I felt such a failure because he could care less about his name and his letters. And then I was like, okay, fine. Let's play with the letters. I would buy all these things with letters because I said, okay, expose them to letters. So I was like, we have letter stamps. And he kept grabbing the X and the O. And I'm like, what am I going to, like, X and O? And then I learned he used to watch Santiago of the Seas in Nickelodeon, which X marks the spot, and that's where the treasure is on the map. And I said, you know what? That means something to him. I'm grabbing onto the X. We're going to learn how the X and, we started pointing it out. And it's not an easy letter to find around, but our supermarket it's called Publix, and it ends with an X. So then it started to be this game. Like before I was like ready to sit down and teach him anything. I was like, okay, let's just make the game. And the O was a lot easier. And he could do a circle. So we would write the O and then we learned how to do the X. So he could not only identify the letter, but he could write it. So it had a meaning to him. And he spent so long with those 2 letters. And I'm like, are you ever ever going to move on to different ones. And we started just kind of implementing a little bit of, seeing those letters. And then I was like, oh, A is my letter, Alexa, and I wouldn't put it on him because he didn't care about his letter. So I put it on mine. So I was like, well, can you do the A? And the A was, easy to, my teaching is so weird because it happens in the car and it happens in the shower. That's like, maybe because I don't have my phone with me. So my brain is more aware that he's right there with me and we're doing things together. And then when the little smoke would come out on the windows in the shower, that was our little blackboard. So we would, like, I taught him how to write in there. We would just come up with little letters. So we just make it fun. And then in the car, we would do kind of like stories. I tried to get him into podcasts, but he just wasn't in it until we came across yours. And I don't know if because he's a lot older now, his attention span's a little better. And one thing that I love about your stories that I've never seen anywhere else is the repetition. It's the repetition. It has like cheese and crackers. So it's catchy, right? So you want to have, like, it makes you want to learn the story so that you could say it, all the time. And at the end of the story, when we were listening to it, we were just doing cheese and crackers. So I'm going to back out a little bit because I jumped into the podcast without meaning to. But so Lara has this great podcast and it's divided into, it's like learning podcast for us parents so that we have the tools to teach our kids or educators. So we have those tools to kind of use stories to teach our kids all of these wonderful things about literacy. And then there's this other side of it that you can actually enjoy with your kids. So if you don't, okay, I know I'm not supposed to say, but if you're not coming up with stories, like made up stories, you can just grab onto Laura's stories. And I heard where you came, your story about your dad and your sister. And I want you to say that because for me, that brings it back to how stories and storytelling, it's a bonding opportunity for our kids. So it's not just the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s, but it's actually coming up with little traditions and coming up with little things that are special, little moments throughout the day that will make it meaningful so we can connect with our kids. And the proof is in the pudding. Look at yourself. Like, you are teaching everybody about literacy. You're teaching everybody about storytelling because you love about it. And I think part of it is because of this story, how stories were used with you and your sister. So tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So on my first episode of my podcast, I shared where I came up with the name of Little Stories That Stick. And one of the things that I always go back to is how stories can stick with us, right? As children and as adults, right? And it's not just stories that are made up, but also the stories we tell ourselves, right? So what's the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves as a parent, about ourselves as a partner or as a friend, these stories that we tell ourselves, right? And so one thing that really sticks out to me when I was growing up, my parents divorced and I was only 6 or 7, and that's a lot to handle and process in itself. And my parents, they lived in separate homes, and we only saw my dad on every other weekend, but also every Wednesday. And we would go to my dad's house on Wednesdays. And, it was after he had a full day of work. We had a full day of school. We maybe had a meal and then like our bedtime routine. And then we would wake up, and he lived like far away from where we had to go to school. So it was like, wake up and go, he'd drop us off at school. So the only time we really had together that wasn't, driven by something was bedtime. And at bedtimes, he would tell us stories. And my memory isn't amazing. So I don't super like retain all the stories, but I know that every week I like looked forward to telling the story because he was a phenomenal storyteller, and he still is. And he would leave it in like a little bit of suspense, right? So it was these like continuous stories. He would tell them over time. So, there'd be characters and it would kind of leave off at like a cliffhanger. And then we'd come back the following week and he would kind of pick up right where we left off, and it would go on and on. And as we got into adulthood, or maybe it was our teenage years, I don't know, whenever it was, I remember at some point we were talking about him telling us stories or whatever, and he shared that his strategy was, in fact, he was reading Stephen King books, and he would take kind of some of the plot lines and the characters and infuse my sister and I into them. And he was basically telling us these like suspenseful, not so much horror and gore stories, but as he was reading his books, he was then crafting how can he make that into a shorter story. And if he left it at a cliffhanger, it was likely because that's where he left off in the book. And so then he would read the next chapters or whatever. And when we would come back the following week, he would pick up where he left off. But it was this, really awesome time where I think he was able to play with us. He was able to feel successful as a parent that was showing up for us and being super present. And I imagine for him, right, he spent all these years co-parenting with my mom. And, we that mothers know, sometimes we become the default parent, right? So when I think about my dad having to take my sister and I that were going through emotional struggles and being separated from our mom and out of routine, he created this beautiful, tradition that made us look forward to coming to be with him. And it was a shared experience and it stuck with us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a beautiful story. And one thing that it made me realize just now is that, okay, I might not be good at coming up with my own stories, but I can take other people's characters and I can come up with my own stories. And I naturally do that in circle time in my classes with songs. Before I couldn't do it, but now I can sing you a song about a potato, about a thing, because I can say, I heard a song about 5 little pumpkins. Well, I'm going to give you 5 little letter P's, like, anything I can give you. And I think the more that you practice, you might not be good at first. Like I'm trying to do the stories with Manu, and I realize that I am so good at coming up with the story and doing it, but I can't finish it. I can never figure out a way to finish the story. So I'm going to have to be like cliffhanger. See you next week.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No, I know. One of my favorite stories to tell my kids is one of the storylines from Harry Potter. I love to tell them about an elf that needs a sock and it's about Dobby. And so the elf is at the house and can't, has to do all the work for the parents and the family and wants to just get out and get a sock. And then there's different ways that he gets a sock, but literally it's just multiple variations of this one character from one book. And it's like one little experience. And that's where I say, I think it's really important that we don't discredit ourselves and know that retelling stories that we've heard, retelling shows, retelling movies, retelling experiences, all of those things are storytelling because they have all the elements of it, right? They're still building vocabulary. You're still connecting with your child. You're still modeling what a story can sound like. You're still using a variety of words. You're still sequencing events. All the things that happen in storytelling, whether you're making up a story or you're telling a book, it's still happening.
Yeah. And I think that's something that, maybe for a preschool child or a 2-year-old child that are not ready to take that step into recognizing letters, that they're just not there yet, or start understanding, the different letter sounds, it's still something you can do with them and get them ready for when they are. So I think like reading, we hear it all the time. Oh, the most important thing you can do for your child is to read. But it's not just to read, it's to storytell, right? It's to expose them to literacy. Like sometimes when we are traveling, I remember like we didn't have the bedtime books. I would read him the hotel menu or the hotel instructions. Just really exposing them to print and to stories in different ways. It still builds that foundation for when they are ready to, start learning those letter sounds and to start identifying those letters. And that's going to build the foundation for reading instead of going, how we started. It's, guessing, this is and this is on, but actually like breaking it down. So I think I would say for those parents that are watching that still have smaller kids, you see me blurry? I totally feel like I'm blurry.
It is. I don't know what. There, better.
Closer. So it's still, I lost my train. So they can still expose them to a lot of books, expose them to print, expose them to storytelling. And I think naturally they will be driven to having that love for learning that we want them to do. Because once you love to read, you can learn anything. Like at any age, like at this point, if I wanted to learn how to build a cart from scratch, I could literally find a book and I'm sure I could build a cart. So I think that's kind of where we want to go, right? We want to give them that foundation to love reading, to love learning, to love, instead of drilling them, memorize this letter, memorize this sound, creating crafts that have no meaning. It's easy. It's better for them to just give them a white paper and be like, can you make up the supermarket? And, and then you'll be like, oh, the cereal, let me help you, right? Lots of like they can write, they can draw pictures before they can write letters. So one of the things I can do, to bond with him and to kind of expose him to that is we do little cities. And then, in chalk outside or in the paper and be like, oh, this is Publix or supermarket. So he will draw the supermarket and I will write it down. He's into logos a lot. So he's like, oh, the Target. So he is able to do the Target. And then I'm like, okay, I'll write next to it. So there's a lot of activities, I say, we can expose them to letters and to that literacy. So what's some of your favorite activities to kind of bring that, besides from like telling stories, that we can bring literacy into the home?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just named a lot of the ways, right? So modeling for them and building it into their play, but also, like you said, it's really following their lead. So some examples that I can give, like right now, my son is super into dinosaurs, right? So whatever ways that I can build it in, right? So I got a book that's D is for dinosaur. And so each page, it teaches a little bit about a dinosaur, it doesn't actually name them, but ways that you can just take what their interest is and then build in ways to, get them to do some pre-writing or pre-reading. And a lot of pre-writing and pre-reading is making marks. So just mark making. Okay. Oh, yeah. You want to make a dinosaur? Like, let's make a dinosaur, a 3D dinosaur out of, cardboard boxes and whatever loose parts we have here. Here's a clipboard. You want to make a plan? And then maybe he's drawing some shapes. And then maybe I'm labeling some of them. Oh, okay. What is this? This is a T-Rex. Okay. So where's its claws? Oh, and then I might just be modeling like claws. Oh, that starts like cat, and I just come commenting out loud about that, right? So modeling that whenever we can, and just leaving mark making tools out for them to be accessible, allowing them to use staplers, tape, scissors, paper, markers, paint, any of those things, and to have access to them to create is really important. Because let's say the other day he was building Jurassic World, and so he was using magnet tiles, and suddenly he was like, how do I make Jurassic World? And I was like, what do you mean? And he meant, how do I write the word Jurassic World? And he was like, I want this to say, this is the gate for Jurassic World. I want it to say Jurassic World. And I was like, oh, do we have anything that says Jurassic World? And he went and he was able to find, we have this like, big thing that you inflate and you punch it, right? And it says Jurassic World on it. And he found that. And then I have magnetic letters. And he actually, for, I don't know, however long it was, 10 minutes, he went over to the thing, he looked, saw the first letter J, and then he went and he looked through all the magnetic letters and he got the J and he put it on. And then he did that letter by letter until he had gotten each letter that wrote out Jurassic World. That 10 minutes was more meaningful for him than anything I could have forced him to do. Right. Even if I said, oh, you're interested in Jurassic World, let's write a book called Jurassic World. Okay, what do you hear at the beginning? Or here's the word Jurassic World, copy it, right? Because I'm dictating that. But this was self-initiated. He built it. He wanted it to say it. And I just, had the materials and pointed and suggested, right? And so that's the key, right? Is like, we've got to, well, as you and I always say, right? We have to trust and play.
Yeah, you have to, because you could have killed that so easily when you're like, okay, let's do J for Jurassic World. Let me print out the J so we can, put dinosaur paw stickers on it, And the other thing that I was thinking is we could also kill it by saying, okay, I write it down here, here's Jurassic World. You just put this Post-it. But instead you're like, well, how can you solve it yourself? And I can facilitate that. And I think we are so used to that when they're babies, we have to do everything for them, that we forget once they grow that there's things we shouldn't do for them, that they should do on their own. And I think when it comes to literacy, we have to encourage and trust them so that they can learn to trust themselves too, that they can get those answers. Because next time that he wants to ride T-Rex, he's going to remember that mom said, do we have something that says, Jurassic World? And then you're just giving them the skills instead of just, what is it? Teach the human, teach them to fish so they can, and not just give them the fish or something like that.
Exactly. Whatever that saying is. Right. Exactly. Right. You want to teach them that the skill is, you want to write something. Maybe you don't know how to spell it in time. They're going to Google it, right? Or they're going to go into a dictionary. And that's the skill that we want them to know, that if you don't know a word, you can find it somewhere else. If you don't know a letter, you can go around our house and find an alphabet chart. I mean, I have alphabet charts hanging everywhere. Over here is their little play table, and right above it is an alphabet chart. And, we just have them around, right? So that I can point to it, and then for my 3-year-old, it's just constant exposure. It's just exposure, exposure, exposure. So I just have letters on a variety of things. I try to pull it in when I can. If, she's cutting paper and it falls in a certain way, I'm like, oh, that looks like the letter X. I just comment, right? And I'm not, I think it's really easy for us. And we do it as parents of young children, right? We kind of quiz them when they're learning their colors, or what does the cow say, right? It's like we ask them those really simple questions that we know they know the answer to, right? And it's starting to really have to pull back on that. And instead of asking them those questions that they know the answer to, instead of asking open-ended questions, or not asking any questions, and just see what unfolds.
That's true. Well, let me see. I think you answered everything. I think one of the I think I want to close it up with some of our favorite things. So a poster about the alphabet. You know what? I gave mine away. I should get one back. I have magnet letters. I have letter stamps. I have translucent letters that we use on the light table sometimes. And I got these fancy ones at Etsy that have the ocean animals. It's like resin letters. They have the little ocean animals inside, because since all he cares about is the ocean, I was like, okay, fine, I'll bring the ocean letters. But one of the things is that he noticed it. I didn't. The turtle was in the W, because the turtle is big and she didn't fit in the T. So the animals don't match where the letter is. And I was like, oh, I guess that could have even been better. But I'm so glad you found that, you made the connection that doesn't match. So I think one of the things, give them plenty of access to materials, like you said, tape and the paper, so that they can build their whatever it's in their head, and you just support their play, expose them to different letters. One
thing I just want to suggest, because I mean, you and I don't know, You were in a classroom. I don't know if you were, but like
No,
I was
I've
in a
never been
classroom.
in the
Oh, no.
classroom.
So my basement is like filled, right? I have too much stuff that has letters on it. But I think that there are also really practical ways we could do things, like just Post-its and paper, right? I mean, Post-its and marker. You can just write letters and just leave them around. Or I've written letters on magnetiles and the Post-its fit in the just right space of it. So you could write the letters of your child's name, or you could write O and X, right? O and X, O and X, O and X, and they could just have O and X that they move around and they match the O's with the X's. Also, another thing that we all have at our disposal is in your cupboard, you have so many boxes of food that have letters on it. So whenever, before I crush up a box of waffles or macaroni or crackers, I find the biggest word on it and I cut it out and I cut those individual letters because they're kind of cardboard, right? They're a little thick and I can stick them in rice. I can just put them by the table with some glue. But there's lots of things that you don't have to go and buy the resin letters, right? Like, there's.
Where were you 4 years ago?
I know.
The thing is, that's the thing, because I haven't been in the classroom. My approach has always been like, let me see what the teachers are doing so that I can do it at home. Like, I always wish that I could just take a little peek at the preschool so that I could see what they were doing and then I could do it at home, because I didn't want to send him I wanted to do it at home, but I didn't know like what to do or what to buy. And a lot of the, when you go to Walmart and when you go to Amazon, those toys, it's like, oh, you want the alphabet? Fine, here's an electronic iPad that when you press it. And so for me, it was a challenge to figure out like what to get. And the letter stamps, I got them from Kristen because she had shared in one of her trainings how the kids were like checking in or something, and she had letter stamps, and she said that's a natural way to expose them to print, to letters through play. And that way I got them I'm lowercase, like the pink, like I got pink and red and orange, ink. And I wish I would have known about the cardboard, because that's such a free thing to do. And in 2 minutes, you can have so many letters. And then, like you said, you just put them with glue, and then who cares if they glue them all on top of each other on a paper, right? You're not paying $50 for the resin letter that please don't lose them. They have more freedom to it. So I love that. So we're coming up to the end of our time. So I got everything that I wanted to ask and everything what I wanted to do. Any last remarks? Any last suggestions?
No, definitely check out my podcast, and you can get some ideas there, and then also stories, like you said, that you can play for yourself. You can listen to and then retell them. I promise you, that's okay. I don't mind. That's what you could do, or play them for your children. Throw them on, like you said, in the car or wherever. And then I also will maybe you can share them. One thing that I didn't super get to talk about is that I've explored this idea of telling stories that are alliterative. So one of the ways, besides playing around with words that rhyme, is playing around with words that all start the same, right? So those two skills are really important for preschoolers and kindergartners to notice and hear. So I made these little storytelling cards where you can see here, there are musicians and a magician with some muffins and a magenta moon, right? So all these pictures lend themselves to things that start with the sound And if you can't make up a story on your own, or you don't want to, there's a little story there that you could come up with. But
you would use the card and then be like, oh, there's this magician who wanted to turn the moon magenta. So they go to the magician. Like, it gives you kind of like the storyline.
Exactly. And even if nothing else, it's just more exposure, right? I just have them laying around, and your child might notice, and they might be like, oh, look at the moon. Why is the moon pink? Oh, it's not pink. That's actually magenta. Another word for pink is magenta. So you're building in vocabulary, and then the M's right there, right? So you might be also saying like, oh, moon, magenta. They both start with right? It's just like a way to, it's not a flashcard. You're not drilling it. But then also, like, I pulled them out this morning because I wanted to talk about them, and my children know them. So they started pulling them, and they were like, oh, tell me this one. Tell me about the frogs in the fire, because they know. And I'm like, oh yeah, which letter do we need to find? And they're like, F. I'm like, that's right. Let's find the F. Okay, here are the frogs in the fire. And then as they started playing, they had some loose parts, and then they were reenacting the firefighters getting the frogs out of the fire. So it's just a way, it's just another thing. And this is, you just print them on paper.
And this is something like you buy and you get in the mail, or is it like a printable?
No, it's a printable. You can just download it and print them. And so I just printed them and then on cardstock.
Okay.
Yeah. Or you can cut out, that's another thing. I always use cereal boxes because I don't like to laminate. I know you do. But laminate.
I would laminate my husband if I could. Like it
never decomposes. And I love the earth too much. So you can print it on plain paper, and then cereal boxes are really sturdy. So they're a great thing to use. So you just glue it on to a cereal box on the back of a cereal box instead of laminating it.
Oh,
but
I like that better. I don't like the texture of the laminating thing, but they're so sturdy.
I know. And I don't like the glare that shines off it sometimes. It can really take away from things. Like whenever I would go into classrooms sometimes and they would have like their big alphabet chart laminated, but then they're referencing it from the rug. And sometimes kids couldn't see the letters because the way the light was shining off it. And it's just not something that you always think about in that moment. Yeah. But that's just a great way. And even like, I will just do that. I played around with it for a while with my daughter. She was really interested in the letter M. So I just told her stories all the time about a mouse that went in a mountain and it made marshmallows, and just tell it slowly, just start saying, and then they'll join in. Right. And so you're just playing around with words, playing around with sounds, talking, telling stories.
I love it. I love it because I love your approach, and I know we're out of time, but I love that approach because the way that I did it over the weekend is I found 10 books for November, like that people usually talk about it in November, and I came up with like some type of activity to do attached to the book, or things that I've done in the class that I was like, oh, if you like the leaf thief, the activity that I did when I did in nature classes, we grab a bunch of leaves, fake here because we live in Florida, and then we just blow them, and it kind of connected the story with the activity and kind of get them interest in all those literacy skills. But I can already see it like in my dining room and like at breakfast time, instead of turning on the tablet, it's like, hey, pick a card. Okay, random. It's your turn, mom. Oh, okay, this is the F. Okay, let's talk about it. So I think it's such a great starting point to create those stories. So as we get those muscles, that creativity muscle of storytelling going. So definitely love that. Thank you for sharing that. I love that. Where can we find them?
Well, on my website or my link in bio on Instagram at Little Stories That Stick. And if you want to share the link in the recording that you share out, feel free.
Yeah, I'll do that. I just want to like close this up so I can download it, so I can print it, so I can find some cereal boxes. So I love it. Thank you, Laura, so much for your time. This was so helpful, and I know it's going to be helpful for so many parents as we lead them through more play and less traditional methods that talk about memorization.
Thanks so much for having me, Alexa.
Thanks.